Well, I really feel like there's three tiers of citizens in Canada right now. We have our naturalized Canadians who are vaccinated, naturalized Canadians who are not vaccinated, and then we have our immigrant population. There seems to be different rules for each of those groups. It would be considered a human rights violation to ask anything about medical capacity.
Mary Ugolini here with Rebel News, continually pointing out the hypocrisy of the Canadian government's pandemic response. And that is further reinforced by the anonymous guest that I am bringing you today. She worked at a temporary staffing agency in Alberta from the onset of the pandemic in March 2020 until the spring of 2021 and has some interesting insights to share in terms of immigration, the legal inability of the agency to ask about vaccine status for employment, and what she coins as a three-tiered citizenry. Check it out. What were some of the things that you were seeing and some of your concerns throughout the response?
Certainly what I noticed the most was an influx of immigrants coming to us looking for their first Canadian job, trying to inject some cash into their households. And a lot of those individuals were professionally trained in their country of origin, but they were coming to a temp staffing agency for basically warehouse and labor positions. It wasn't aligned with their training and skill sets that allowed them to immigrate.
What is the government missing there in terms of being able to align individuals coming into Canada as new Canadians, as you say, with a job that fits their criteria from their home country?
I think the government is missing an entire program to align those people with appropriate opportunities in Canada. It seems, from my experience, that the individuals are welcome into the country based on their professional credentials, but then left to their own devices to find suitable employment.
And of course, it goes without saying that there's a major hypocrisy here with the government's COVID response, from travel restrictions to mandates. What were you seeing at the agency in terms of the welcoming of new Canadians? And was it in alignment with travel restrictions and things like vaccine passports and mandates?
I did not see it as in alignment with how naturalized Canadians were being treated. People were immigrating to our country when there were travel bans in place. So first violation or challenge between different groups, they were allowed to travel and fly. Many were coming from countries that did not have vaccine rollout at that point. We were just starting the rollout in December of 2020. So many people, especially younger age groups, had not been vaccinated yet. So the vaccine passports were just being discussed. They weren't in place. But from the HR perspective, we were not allowed to ask any of those questions. Under the legislation that covers the HR process, it would be considered a human rights violation to ask anything about medical capacity or medical status.
So maybe you can elaborate on that a little bit for me, because as I understand from what you're saying, the Human Resources Department is not legally allowed to ask or request disclosure of personal private medical information. But meanwhile, you have to provide that information to a hostess at a restaurant who may be not even legal drinking age in order to dine in at their establishment. How do you piece that together?
I really don't. I feel like a lot of the medical mandates that were put in place by provincial and federal governments were misaligned with the human rights legislation that is in effect in Canada. I feel like any of our federal employees who've lost their job based on either not disclosing or not vaccinating, I believe that they have a court case.
Mm-hmm. What are some of those? If you could walk us through it, what are some of those human resources principles that don't give you the authority to request this information of people, even seeking temporary staffing agency services?
Yeah, we're very limited in what we can ask. We can ask for work history, payroll information if the person is going to become employed, but we are not allowed to ask anything that would be falling under a discriminatory category. So race, gender, sexual identity, medical questions, any kind of physical or mental disability, we cannot ask any of those questions because it's considered to be a human rights violation.
And so obviously this includes the new Canadians that were coming into the country during these travel restrictions. And as I already mentioned, the peak pandemic pandemonium and the
arguably failed government response that ensued. What's your takeaway there in terms of this, as you referred to it, this tiered citizenry that's happening based on our government's response?
Well, I really feel like there's three tiers of citizens in Canada right now. We have our naturalized Canadians who are vaccinated, naturalized Canadians who are not vaccinated, and then we have our immigrant population. There seems to be different rules for each of those groups and different restrictions for each of those groups. And I truly feel that inequality amongst people based on medical status or country of origin, time in the country, it needs to be addressed.
Mm-hmm. What would your message be? How can the government adjust or change that moving forward, in your opinion?
I think it's a very complex problem. I think that the current mandates need to be reviewed and hopefully removed very quickly so that Canadians can get back to being Canadians and being treated equally. But right now there's inequity amongst Canadians that I don't feel like that represents our country the way that we want to be represented on a world stage.
Isn't it interesting that the arbitrary enforcement of vaccine mandates disregards well-established human resources legislation in terms of violating privacy and rights? It's something many of us have known all along, but the more that the hypocrisy is highlighted and knee-jerk reactions scrutinized, it becomes increasingly clear that this response was not always about health and safety, but rather compliance. For Rebel News, I'm Tamara Ugolini. If you like my shirt and agree that it should be your choice whether or not to partake in a medical experiment, then check out our online store at rebelnewsstore.com. In there, we have a great selection of new designs to fit your freedom-loving desires and offer free shipping globally. That website again is rebelnewsstore.com.